or destroys value. For these firms, we need not consider growth at all. Third, only for firms protected from competition by sustainable competitive advantages, those that can earn above their cost of capital on growth investments, does growth create value. And even these good, from here on we will dispense with the quotation marks, businesses, are likely to create value only when their growth is within or adjacent to protected markets. So the first question we must address in evaluating growth is whether a company meets these criteria. Its earnings power value is above its asset value. It operates in a market in which it has sustainable competitive advantages. It currently earns above its cost of capital, and it is likely to make growth investments in current or adjacent markets to which its competitive advantages can be extended. The term value investors use to describe such businesses, following Warren Buffett, is franchises. Because they will have current earnings power values well above the value of the assets values will not be critical to determining what they are worth. The enhanced importance of earnings and the need to value growth means that we must apply a tailored valuation approach to franchise businesses. We can no longer rely just on asset and earnings power values as a check on each other and as a test of whether we have a franchise business. This chapter will describe the process of identifying franchises. The recognition that franchise businesses are different from others and must be valued in their own way, not just using a one-size-fits-all DCF approach, is one of the critical insights of modern Graham and Dodd investing. Investors use several indicators to identify good businesses. They look for high profit margins that return large amounts of cash to their owners, even as they are growing rapidly. The high margins may be high returns on sales, gross margins, operating margins, or net income margins, especially relative to competitors in the same industry. But ultimately, good businesses are ones that earn high returns on capital invested. There are alternative ways to measure returns on capital invested. 1. Returns on equity, ROE, or net income divided by the book value of the equity. 2. Return on capital, operating income divided by net debt plus equity invested. 3. After-tax returns on capital, net income plus net interest paid divided by net debt plus equity. Good businesses steadily earn returns of 15 to 20% or more by these measures, well above a typical 10% cost of capital. These returns should increase rather than erode over time. Good businesses are also ones that grow. Growing firms can have either high levels of investment per unit sales, asset-heavy, or low levels of investment, asset-light. The asset-heavy firms are desirable because they can deploy a lot of capital at high rates of return. The asset-light firms are capable of earning especially high rates of return because, requiring so little capital to support growth, they can distribute most of their profits. In both cases, the key to these sustainably high returns and the value of growth lies in the economic characteristics of franchise businesses, the qualitative factors that enable them to protect these returns from competitive erosion. What good businesses look like. There is widespread agreement that good businesses in market economies are those that enjoy sustainable competitive advantages over other companies. Sustainable competitive advantages, if held by incumbent firms, create barriers to entry. Barriers to entry are what Warren Buffett and other value investors refer to as moats. Franchise businesses, in the language of value investing, are simply businesses whose operations are protected from competition by wide, long-lived moats. These sustainable incumbent competitive advantages, barriers to entry, moats, and franchises are all terms that refer to the same underlying features of a business environment. The only problematic term in these expressions that are more or less synonymous is the role of incumbency in qualifying relevant competitive advantages. In certain situations, incumbents operate at competitive disadvantages. For example, where technology is changing rapidly, a newcomer may be able to leapfrog an incumbent and set up operations with a later generation of equipment at lower cost. Situations such as these are inherently unstable and benefit no one except consumers. Today's entrant is tomorrow's incumbent. If the technology continues to evolve, the entrant's competitive advantage will itself be undermined by a newcomer whose kit is even more advanced. The result is that no company establishes sustainable barriers to entry that might protect it from relentless competition. There are no good businesses in a competitive environment with relentless change. There may be widespread agreement that competitive advantages, barriers to entry, moats, and franchises are the essential economic factor for defining a good business. There is less agreement on what competitive advantages look like. One common view is that good businesses are synonymous with strong brand images. If customers perceive a brand as superior to competing products, it should be able to command a premium price. These premium prices should lead to the high profit margins characteristic of good business. A careful examination of the history of actual businesses suggests that things are not so simple. In Table 7.1, the left column contains businesses that have historically earned high profits. These are matched with high-profile brands in the right column that, for all the luster associated with their names, have not generally been nearly so profitable. Individual consumers certainly do not expect to bask in the reflected glory of products like Colgate toothpaste, Tide detergent, Purina dog chow, the Buffalo Evening News, or a Walmart shirt. On the other hand, showing up in a Mercedes-Benz, a Rolls, or a Cadillac may turn heads and elevate the status of the owner, at least in some eyes. These are the iconic brands, widely used to connote quality and class. They have become metaphors, the Rolls-Royce of stoves or the Cadillac of lawnmowers. Nobody calls something the Coca-Cola of handbags or even of vodkas. Sony is widely recognized for the quality of its products. The Hoover name was so widely recognized that in many parts of the world, it became synonymous with vacuum cleaners, the Kleenex of vacuums, we might say. Yet for all their iconic appeal, these brands and the companies that produce them have not been extraordinarily profitable, especially when compared with the less glamorous brands in the column on the left. Rolls-Royce and General Motors, the maker of Cadillac, have gone through bankruptcies. In the U.S. cell phone market, it was not the former monopoly with the universally known brand, AT&T, that won out, but its regional offspring and then competitors, Verizon and Southwestern Bell, which eventually bought AT&T and took its name, that came out on top. Local newspapers, like those owned by Gannett, have historically been more profitable than revered national names like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, even as the latter have dominated the competition for journalist awards and recognition. Whole industries, such as cosmetics with high levels of advertising and brand awareness, are often far less profitable than no-name businesses like title insurance, in which FNF is a leading competitor. Brands simply do not tell anything like the whole story about what constitutes a sustainable competitive advantage and therefore a good business. First mover advantage is a second frequently cited competitive advantage that looks even worse as an indicator of historical profitability. In Table 7.2, arrays first movers with the companies that ultimately came to dominate their industries and achieve much higher profitability. In many cases, such as airlines, Pan Am and TWA, automobiles, Ford, and personal computers, Atari, Apple, pioneers have given way to competitive markets in which no one earns the returns we expect of a good business. In other instances, such as personal computer operating systems, ISPs, Internet Service Providers, internet search engines, and television networks, pioneers have been displaced by later, now dominant competitors. In a handful of industries, notably online auctions, eBay, the first mover, has managed to remain the dominant competitor. First movers have been no better than companies with esteemed brands in achieving sustainable competitive advantages and the profitability that we expect from good businesses. Other approaches, rooted more in the field of business strategy than investing, typically depend on many factors or long lists of potential competitive advantages to identify good businesses and appropriate business strategies. Probably the most notable example of this approach is Michael Porter's 5 Forces analysis, which looks not just at barriers to entry, but also an intra-industry competition, supplier power, customer power, and substitute products. The problem with these approaches is that they are unwieldy, difficult to apply in practice, and often lead to ambiguous conclusions that can be used to justify conflicting judgments of the strength of any particular competitive advantage. When the creator of this approach sought to identify good, generic business strategies, the 5 Forces tellingly played no role in his analysis. Since understanding the special characteristics of a franchise business is so central to modern Graham and Dodd valuation approaches, we would like a simple, transparent, and accurate approach to identify the competitive advantages that distinguish good franchise businesses from the others. We will begin with an example that seeks to classify the mechanisms of competition and thus the ultimate factors that protect company returns from its consequences. Toasted earnings. Consider a hypothetical company. We will call it Top Toaster because toasters are what it makes that has been particularly successful. For the last 5 years, it has earned around $20 million each year. To keep things simple, we will state that there is no substantial difference between reported net income and the amount of earnings it can distribute to shareholders. Investors in the company are willing to accept a 10% annual return on their investment. Applying the EPV equation we developed in Chapter 5, the EPV of the toaster company is earnings times 1 divided by cost of capital, $20 million divided by 10%, or $200 million. Assume next that the company's asset value is $80 million. This figure includes all the tangible assets, cash, accounts receivable, inventory, and plant, property, and equipment, each adjusted to reflect any differences between the figures on the company's books and the actual money a competitor would need to spend to reproduce them, and the intangibles as well, including consumer recognition and reputation, product design, production know-how, worker training, distribution channel development, whose reproduction also requires expense. There is a $120 million discrepancy here between the asset value and the EPV, and if the stock market should value the company at $300 million, then the gap above the asset value would be wider still. Unfortunately for Top Toaster, the EPV of $200 million and the market value of $300 million will be a green flag to potential competitors. Some bright entrepreneur, perhaps someone already in the small appliance business, or an executive at another toaster company with access to investment capital and experience with retail outlets, will recognize that they can produce this income stream worth $200 million for an investment of only $80 million. Or, to put it differently, they can earn $20 million a year on an $80 million investment, a 25% return that almost qualifies as exorbitant. The entrepreneur enters the toaster business by opening a new plant, expanding the capacity of an existing one, or finding a contractor to produce the toasters. He or she finds or buys an acceptable design, develops attractive packaging, and hires experienced sales agents to hawk the stuff. Assume for the moment that toasters are a commodity-like product, meaning that they are more or less interchangeable with one another and are selected entirely on the basis of price. Increased competition means more toasters on the market, and more toasters means lower toaster prices. As toaster prices fall, the profits of all toaster companies fall in tandem with one another. As the earnings of top toaster start to shrink, so does its earning power. After the first competitive wave hits, assume that earnings decline to $16 million. Unfortunately, the waves continue to break. Earnings of $16 million, with a desired return of 10%, value the company at $160 million. The assets still cost $80 million to replicate. That leaves an $80 million gap, sufficient inducement for a second entrepreneur to start stamping out toasters. In fact, only after the gap disappears and the EPV falls to $80 million will new entrants, or incumbents expanding their production, stop their invasion of top toasters' inviting financial territory. The process ends, in other words, when there are so many indistinguishable toasters on the market that prices and profits have fallen to the level at which none of the suppliers earns more than the cost of capital that investors demand on their money. For many toaster companies, life will be even nastier, shorter, and more brutish. The final industry price at which any incentive to enter will have been eliminated will be one at which only the most efficient toaster producers will survive. Inefficient incumbent producers, those who cannot meet this price, will leave the business. It is the entry of the lowest cost, most efficient producers that drives prices, not the threat of future inefficient ones who will simply stay away. In this competitive process, it is the strongest competitors that matter, not the weaker ones. The problem of declining profits in the face of increased price competition has challenged thousands of companies that cannot distinguish their goods or services from those of other players. It is a truth universally acknowledged that all sensible people abhor commodity businesses, the archetype of bad businesses. The standard advice for avoiding this fate is to differentiate your product or service from all the others. For top toaster, that means spending money on advertising, adding product features, or changing the design. All of these may work to temporarily insulate top toaster from the immediate pressure to cut its price. Unfortunately, these moves do not solve the fundamental problem. The competitors are still there, aiming for a share of top toaster's attractive market. Nothing prevents them from introducing competing designs, adding their own features, and matching top toaster's spending on advertising. Inevitably, they take away some of top toaster's business. Even if its prices do not decline, top toaster sells fewer units, but fixed costs such as product development, package design, and advertising do not decrease proportionately. In the face of active competition, they may actually rise. At the same time, top toaster is not going to be able to raise prices, and its variable costs are not declining. If anything, intensified competition for resources will drive variable costs up. Top toaster finds itself staggered by two blows. It is selling fewer toasters, and because its fixed costs are spread over fewer units, its profit margin on each one has contracted. Overall earnings decline, as in a commodity market, until EPV and asset value are equal. Differentiating the toaster is at best a short-term fix. New entrepreneurs will keep showing up, or old competitors continue expanding. Toaster production will keep increasing, and products will proliferate until the profit opportunity motivating it disappears, until, that is, the $80 million of assets produces an income stream of $8 million, provided investors still will take a 10% return on their capital. At that point, the EPV and the reproduction cost of the assets are equal to one another, and there is no easy money to be made by entering or expanding in the toaster business. It doesn't matter if the toaster is a commodity and sells only on price, or a differentiated product and sells on features, providing top toaster with discretionary control of prices. So long as top toaster cannot separate itself from the competition, new entrants will appear until the EPV becomes equal to the asset value. This equality is not an accident. It is a fundamental economic condition, and it results from the corrosive influence of competition on prices and profit margins. The process of competition again displays itself by the ability of other firms to enter or expand in quest of a profit opportunity. The proximate causes of profit erosion for a firm with differentiated products like top toaster are not identical to what would be the case with pure commodities. Rising unit costs and declining unit sales are the villains, not declining prices. But the end result is the same. Only the most efficient toaster producers survive, and in the long run, returns on capital are driven down to the cost of capital. Moreover, in both commodity and differentiated product competition, periods of temporary prosperity will attract enthusiastic entry. This will often be followed by extended periods of overcapacity due to the long-lived nature of the capacity the new entrants have added. So even though average results over the long term should just equal the cost of capital, there may be significant fluctuations around this level. Although this process is rough on the top toasters of the world and on their investors, it is a benefit for consumers, meaning all those who had been financing the difference between the EPV and the asset value with the price they paid for toasters. Automobiles. Value in the nameplate? Top toaster and its competitors are figments of our imagination, but in the absence of barriers that impede entry, the process through which the value of the firm in the long run comes to equal the value of the assets is real enough. And this process works, even in situations where companies and products benefit from strong brand images. An example from recent history confirms the theory. In the entire world, there are few brand names as widely recognized as Mercedes-Benz. It is universally associated with a superior product, high in quality and prestige. The cars themselves are immediately distinguishable from other automobiles by the Mercedes-Benz star, which serves as both hood ornament and icon for the corporate commitment to excellence. By all rules of product differentiation, Mercedes-Benz ought to enjoy a strongly protected market position and, as a consequence, high profitability. Yet for the 3 years, 1995 to 1997, before the company acquired Chrysler, Daimler's pre-tax return on the identifiable assets in its automotive business averaged 7.2%. If there is a franchise here, it does not show up in the returns being generated. They are at or below any reasonable cost of capital for the automobile industry. We can also analyze this situation from a value perspective. Suppose that the cost of capital for Daimler-Benz is 10%. In 1997, the automotive division earned 3.5 billion DM pre-tax. Based on these figures, its EPV would be 35 billion DM, again pre-tax. The reproduction value of its assets is equal at least to these amounts. The book value of capital was approximately 30 billion DM at the end of 1997. This excludes the cost of reproducing the engineering knowledge, images, dealer network, and organizational experience of the corporation. At a minimum, that would amount to an additional 10 billion DM, representing 3 years of R&D. A new entrant would gain precious little above this asset value of 40 billion DM by entering Mercedes-Benz's market. Mercedes-Benz is not unique. The history of the automobile market in the United States illustrates the same characteristics. General Motors was a master of product differentiation. Its range of brands, from Chevrolet at the low end through Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac, was intended to segment the market based on images tailored to particular demographics and income levels. In the 1960s, this strategy produced annual returns on capital that averaged 46%, implying an EPV well in excess of asset values. European car manufacturers looked at this return as a measure of the profit opportunities in the American car market. They judged that GM enjoyed neither superior technology nor fundamental advantages in reaching customers, nor, in a market becoming increasingly global, advantages of scale. Over the course of the 1960s and 1970s, Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW, Jaguar, Rover, Citroën, Renault, Peugeot, Volvo, and Saab all expanded aggressively in the United States. General Motors' average return on capital fell to 28% for the 1970s. But the invasion did not stop. Starting in the 1970s, the Japanese entered the U.S. market in force. By the 1980s, Japanese manufacturers had the luxury car market in their sights. Honda started with its Acura line, followed by Toyota with Lexus, and finally, Nissan with Infiniti. By the 1990s, GM's return on capital had fallen to 6 to 7%, and in 2009, during the Great Recession, the company went bankrupt. In a competitive market, it was no longer an efficient producer. Globalization of the car market, including even the most luxurious and highly differentiated brands of the luxury car market, created irresistible competitive pressure. In practice, as well as in theory, the absence of barriers to entry meant that product differentiation alone could not sustain a good business. The nature of a franchise. The critical element in both the top toaster fable and the history of the luxury car market is the process of entry and the ability of entrants to compete with the established firms. So long as newcomers can develop and distribute new products on an equal footing with incumbents, they have, for example, an equal ability to differentiate, then all products are effectively commodities. Companies that have above-average earnings for sustained periods of time benefit from the inability of competitors, both actual and potential, to do what they do, and they are generally awarded higher valuations in the market. None of this means that brands have no value. A strong brand is an asset like any other. Its value is equal to its reproduction cost. However, if the value of a brand is equal to what it costs to create, then branding by itself is not the source of value. Value is only created when the incumbent has abilities that new entrants cannot match. When a potential entrant sees top toasters earning $20 million per year on assets of $80 million, it must recognize that it will not be able to do as well. Top Toaster must enjoy a competitive advantage over would-be rivals. The newcomer will stay out of the market if it sees that it cannot compete on equal terms. Top Toaster's competitive advantage acts as a barrier to entry and puts a brake on the profit-eroding process that occurs when entrants are able to compete on potentially equal terms. Another way to say the same things is that the continued existence of Top Toaster's profitable franchise depends on the existence of competitive advantages it enjoys. These act as barriers to entry and deter competitors. They are the major sources in a modern market economy of any value that exceeds the cost of reproducing a firm's assets. Competitive advantages. Contrary to popular management discourse, there are only a few types of competitive advantages. Examples of sustained competitive advantages in the business world are the exception rather than the rule. The simplest form is the advantage created by the government when it grants a license to one or several firms to engage in some kind of business, leaving everyone else excluded. Cable franchises, broadcast television stations, telephone companies, and electric utilities all enjoyed exclusive local franchises. Potential competitors were deterred by law. As technology has changed, so have the regulatory and licensing regimes under which these firms operate, and some formerly protected businesses have had to learn to compete. It is unlikely that all forms of exclusive, governmentally generated franchises will disappear. However, governments in modern constitutional democracies are not generally committed to making business owners rich. Exclusive government franchises tend to be restricted to the few industries, electric utilities, cable TV, and local telephone service, where the underlying cost structures mean that the most efficient configuration is to have a single provider and the duplication of basic infrastructure is inherently wasteful. Economists describe these industries as natural monopolies. In exchange for awarding exclusive franchises, governments usually get to control prices and profits to make sure that the selected companies do not earn excessive returns. To the extent that governments are successful in their oversight, the firms will earn just their cost of capital on both future and past investments. As a result, these regulated monopolies should have asset values equal to EPVs and should create no long-term value through growth. From a value perspective, therefore, we are going to be much more interested in franchises that arise outside the protection of government regulation than those that are subject to it. Cost and revenue advantages. The list of non-government competitive advantages follows from the basic profit equation of any business. Revenues less costs equals profits. One key term in the equation is costs. Potential competitors of Top Toaster or Mercedes-Benz might be deterred because they are unable to meet the low costs of these firms. The only way such cost advantages are sustainable is if the incumbents possess production techniques or products that the entrants cannot match. Patents, for example, whether on the products themselves or the process of producing them, create one kind of cost-based competitive advantage. Know-how, sometimes described as the downward-sloping learning curve, is another important advantage. Even as it gains experience, the entrant will always trail the incumbent in the necessary expertise it takes to make things efficiently. The test here is whether the required technology, including the human-based skill, is accessible to the entrant on the same terms as it is to the incumbent. Neither Top Toaster nor Mercedes-Benz has access to technology or other knowledge that is not equally available to their potential competitors. Another possible cost advantage is access to cheap resources like labor and capital. This advantage is hardly ever found in practice. Most resources are mobile and plentifully available on a global basis, and there is nothing that inhibits entrants from acquiring them on the same terms as incumbents. Some firms with unionized labor or other constraints may be forced to operate with high resource costs, but the incumbent has to worry about its most efficient competitor, not its least. Firms that operate in countries with low wage costs, such as China, are often thought of as having a competitive advantage based on their ready access to cheap labor, but this advantage is illusory. Their strong competitors are in China and other low-wage countries, and they all have access to similar labor pools. Some companies make the argument that their advantage is access to cheap capital. This argument takes two forms. Large companies often refer to advantages associated with deep pockets, implying access to large amounts of capital at costs their competitors cannot match. The competitors they have in mind are much smaller, the mom-and-pop businesses that play such a large role in American economic folklore. But these small firms are their weakest competitors, not the relevant, strong competitors who are invariably large firms with pockets equally deep. Companies that talk about deep pockets as a competitive advantage end up emptying those pockets much more frequently than they fill them. A second common version of the cheap capital argument arises when companies have sold securities in favorable capital market conditions, and their competitors are faced with the need to raise capital on less attractive terms. Consider a firm that issued long-term debt at an interest rate of 2%. Suppose that the yield on comparable long-term debt had risen to 7%. The price competitors would have to pay to raise funds today. The fortunate company may feel that with a cost of capital of 2%, it has a competitive advantage over the companies paying 7%. Again, this supposed advantage is an illusion. Devoting the proceeds of the 2% bond issue to projects yielding 2%, when these funds can reliably earn 7% elsewhere, buying the competitors' bonds, for example, is gross stupidity, and stupidity is never a competitive advantage. The true cost of these funds is today's 7% opportunity costs, not the original 2% contract cost. Genuine cost advantages related to inputs are usually based on specialized resources, such as a mine with particularly high-grade ore, a store with a prime location, or a special talent, like Beyoncé, signed at a favorable price. But 3 points need to be made about even these resource advantages. First, the mine, the store location, or the talent is often controlled by someone outside the company, a government, a real estate company, or the talent herself. At some point, the terms will be renegotiated, and the competitive advantage will be priced away. Specialized resource advantages are often short-term ones. Second, such specialized resources are fungible. There is no particular reason why they reside in a particular company. They can, therefore, be regarded as special assets rather than competitive advantages. Third, and related, these special resources are not barriers to entry unless they are truly irreplaceable and fully occupy a market. Unless an efficient copper mine is capable of providing so much supply that there is no room for other, higher-cost entrants, it will not represent a barrier to entry. The same applies to store locations. New stores will be built either near the special location or in competing areas. These stores will attract customers, and despite its favorable location, the existing company will see some of its customers shop elsewhere. Similarly, Beyoncé will face competition as new musical talent appears all the time. It makes more sense to think of special resources as assets rather than competitive advantages. An important distinction is that these kinds of assets only rarely generate growth-related value. Proprietary technology is a more common source of cost advantage, but it also tends to be fairly limited both in the range of industries in which it is significant and in the extent to which it contributes to barriers to entry. In industries subject to rapid change, both patent protection and proprietary experience-based advantages tend to be short-lived. Technological advantages are usually specific to particular technologies. They disappear when a technology is replaced by a better alternative. In high-tech industries, this sort of generational change occurs frequently, and current advantages must be constantly renewed to make them durable. A company's ability to maintain its lead through many generations, like Intel, is by no means guaranteed. As a consequence, technological advantages in the high-tech sector are generally of short duration. At the other end of the spectrum, in low-tech service businesses such as retailing, the pace of technological change is glacial. After a time, most innovations that were once leading edge become embedded in industry-wide practices, spreading from the developers or early adopters to all the firms that operate efficiently. It is primarily in those industries with intermediate rates of technological change that proprietary technology represents a significant competitive advantage. Customer demand advantages. The other key term in the profit equation is revenues, which depend on customer demand. If the incumbent is to have a competitive advantage here, it must have superior access to those customers that are the source of that demand. For this incumbent demand advantage to persist, customers must in some way be captive to those incumbents. In an open and competitive economy, there are only a limited number of ways in which customer behavior leads to captivity. Habit, usually associated with high purchase frequency, is probably the most powerful. For a soda company to compete with Coca-Cola, it must induce Coca-Cola drinkers to stop drinking their favorite beverage. This is no easy task. Consumer studies and historical experience suggest that Coke drinkers are fiercely attached to their Cokes. By comparison, the attachment to Budweiser, another leading beverage brand, is weaker. When diners go to Chinese, Japanese, or Mexican restaurants, they have no reluctance to order a beer from that country, but the chances of them asking for a local cola are slim. For items that are not on the weekly shopping list, there are other processes through which customers are made captive to specific products or services. If the cost of searching for an alternative to the existing supplier is high, then new entrants have a difficult time attracting customers who are not actually dissatisfied with their current arrangements. Take the case of the residential insurance market. There are many dimensions to a policy, in addition to its cost: coverage, deductibles, levels of service, exceptions, creditworthiness of the carrier, and several others. Unless they are strongly motivated, few homeowners are going to take the trouble to search for a replacement. Their aversion to change is reinforced in this example by the painful results that may ensue from an inappropriate choice. It hurts to have the wrong insurance carrier or policy after the disaster strikes. Given these difficulties and dangers, a new entrant into this market will find it difficult to induce customers who have had decent experiences with their existing carriers, even to begin searching for a replacement. Practically the only way the entrant can make any inroads is by offering to write the insurance at premiums substantially lower than the incumbents are charging. As long as incumbent pricing policies are neither inflexibly unresponsive to competition nor overly aggressive, this is almost always a losing strategy. Entry in situations like this stop well before the high profit levels of the incumbents are completely eliminated. In the model we have proposed here, the high search cost limits the arrival of new entrants, and the gap between the asset values and the earnings power values of the incumbents does not disappear. High switching costs are the third and probably the most common source of customer captivity. If it costs money, time, and effort for a customer to switch from one supplier to another, incumbents have an advantage over entrants. For example, when a company changes software systems for payroll, benefits management, internal communications, funds transfer, or other important functions, they have to spend not only on the software, but also on extensive retraining of their staff. That is bad enough. Even worse, the error rate on the new installation still goes up. It is no wonder that there is a powerful bias toward keeping the current system. And if this is true for functions such as payroll, it is 10 times truer for the aptly named mission-critical or even enterprise-critical systems that manage order entry, purchasing, production, inventory, shipping, billing, and accounts receivable. The corporate graveyard is filled with firms that bet the business on introducing a new, improved, integrated, and full-featured system and lost. Switching costs are a powerful source of competitive advantage for companies such as Microsoft and, in a previous computer era, IBM. An entrant going after this business will not be playing on a level field. Because most users are already familiar with Microsoft systems, any successful entrant must overcome the costs to those customers of switching to an unfamiliar alternative. Additionally, as computer users increasingly communicate with each other, Any single user incurs additional costs of switching to a new software supplier unless all others do so at the same time. It doesn't pay to have the best communication program in the world if there is no one else connected to it. Less dramatically, there is a cost to switching anytime the new supplier has to master the particulars of the customer, client, or patient. And this applies to new lawyers, banks, and service companies, such as mechanics who are familiar with the existing systems, health insurance plans, and drugs for a doctor who must learn the risks and potentials of the new medication. It also applies to Google competitors who must learn to process search queries for users as effectively as Google, which has had many years of individual experience to adapt its search procedures to meet the needs of each customer. Neither the fictional top toaster nor the very material Mercedes-Benz and its luxury car rivals are likely to benefit from significant customer captivity. Purchases are infrequent and not driven to any significant degree by habit. Search costs are low for top toaster. They may even be negative for luxury automobiles, where search involves visiting attractive showrooms, being catered to by attentive sales staff, and taking test drives in luxurious new cars, hardly an onerous process. Finally, once a decision has been made to replace an existing toaster or automobile, the switching costs are generally the same no matter which alternative a customer selects. In the language of marketing, it is brand loyalty, not brand image, that is critical. Neither top toaster nor Mercedes-Benz are likely to be brands with high loyalty and repeat purchases. We contended earlier that although the term barriers to entry was frequently used by investment analysts, generally to justify the high price of a particular security, in a world where businesses fiercely compete with one another, real barriers come in very few forms. The clearest cut are governmental privileges, such as licenses, patents, copyrights, or other protections that keep potential competitors at a safe distance. The other barriers we have described stem from either cost, supply, or customer demand advantages. These consist chiefly of proprietary technology or customer captivity. Given that they address the two halves of the profit equation, it is natural to think that they exhaust useful categories of competitive advantage. They do not, especially where we emphasize the sustainability of competitive advantages. There is a third important category that has to be identified and discussed in detail. Economies of scale and sustainable competitive advantages. The downside to the advantages of customer captivity and proprietary technology is that they have limited lives. As we discussed before, technology advantages are inherently transitory. They erode in the presence of both rapid and slow change. Customer captivity is generally long-lived, but like technologies, customers eventually die. Sometimes this is literally true. At other times, they simply move on as tastes change and buying habits mature. Children are captive customers with strong habitual preferences, but they don't stay children forever. A company marketing to youngsters has to capture each generation of children anew. For a company to benefit from barriers to entry over an extended period of time, it must enjoy competitive advantages in the process for acquiring new generations of technology and of customers. This is what advantages of scale provide. The benefits of scale advantages are straightforward. Current and potential competitors cannot match an incumbent's performance because they cannot match its scale of operation. The advantages of scale have to be found either in lower costs or greater access to customers. For the advantages to be durable, the company has to be able to defend its position. If competitors can easily steal away customers, then the scale advantage evaporates. Finally, the advantages conferred by greater scale must be material. Smaller competitors must operate at a significant disadvantage. If the advantages of scale are largely achieved with a mere 2 to 3% market share, then it will be difficult to deny them to any potential competitors. The cost side of economies of scale is related to the proportion that fixed costs account for in the entire cost structure. When fixed costs are a major part, the more units a company makes, the lower its average costs, provided that variable costs do not increase with scale, because the fixed cost burden is shared over more units. In our age, the archetypal example is off-the-shelf software, programs that are sold to thousands and millions of users. It costs a fortune to organize the operation, design the program, write the code, debug it, and get it tested by hundreds of users. It costs virtually nothing to publish one more box of CD-ROMs, even less to distribute it via internet downloads or to have it available in the electronic cloud for a subscription fee. Under these conditions, a competitor who can acquire a majority share of the market will enjoy lower unit costs than other firms in the business. On the demand side, economies of scale take the form of network effects. This refers to situations in which the more customers who use a particular product, the more valuable it becomes to each individual customer. Microsoft has been the beneficiary of these network effects, both for the Windows operating system and its business suite of application programs, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and Outlook. If these are the common tools of white-collar workers in businesses and other organizations, then schools are going to train their students on them so that graduates will be ready when they transition to work. And to complete the circle, businesses that hire these students will also use Microsoft products because the cost of training is minimized compared to what it might be with more esoteric competitive products, no matter how technically superior they might be. Similarly, if most online individual sellers of stuff they want to unload or even sell commercially operate through eBay using PayPal as a preferred payment option, more buyers will be attracted because of the greater range of choices than elsewhere and will need to master only PayPal as a payment mechanism. The buyer experience is simplified and improved for auction-like purchases from a widely dispersed universe of sellers. The same conditions apply on the seller side: more customers and only one payment system to master. The network effect helps both buyers and sellers deal more efficiently with larger markets. These same features apply even more powerfully in aptly named social networks. Facebook is the most obvious example, and would be even without a movie credit. It has reinforced its barriers to entry by buying potential competitors such as Instagram and WhatsApp before they could mount serious challenges. The critical feature of these scale advantages is that they apply equally to existing and potentially new technologies and customers. In the case of proprietary technology, consider the competition between Intel and Advanced Micro Devices (AMD) to produce the next generation of microprocessors for personal computers. If Intel has the dominant market share today and expects to continue to dominate the microprocessor market in the future, it will have resources 8 to 10 times the size of AMD. If the two companies spend the same proportion of revenue on R&D, meaning the same level per each unit sold, Intel will be able to spend 8 to 10 times as much in pursuit of the next generation of microprocessors as AMD. AMD may sometimes get lucky and produce a microprocessor that temporarily outperforms Intel's current product line. But given the disparity in spending on R&D, Intel will soon have a new generation of products that outperforms AMD. In the long run, the race for new technology, given the resource disparity, will always be won by Intel. Intel will also have advantages in attracting new customers, meaning new PC manufacturers. Intel has the choice of spending less than AMD as a percentage of sales, say only 5 times in total more than AMD, as has historically been the case and with lower unit costs, charge PC manufacturers lower prices. Also, Intel benefits from significant network effects. Because the Intel/Microsoft standard dominates the PC market, applications programmers tend to write programs that work especially well in that environment. The result is a greater range and quality of applications programs for PCs with Intel chips. This numerical and operational superiority induces manufacturers to prefer Intel's chip architecture and wait for its next generation of processors rather than switch to an AMD chip with currently superior technology. Because of this advantage with customers, the Microsoft/Intel system has remained dominant through 20-plus generations of technology over 30 years. This is the sustainability of economies of scale in action, even in a sector with robust technological change. Economies of scale are also sustainable in low-technology markets. Consider a retailer such as Walmart in a local market, such as Arkansas, where it has 60% of the market share. Local distribution, warehouses, and trucks to carry goods to individual stores all benefit from local economies of scale. With higher sales, Walmart warehouses will have greater throughput rates and lower unit costs than those of smaller competitors. Its trucks will have shorter routes for the same volume and thus lower unit delivery costs. Local advertising is a fixed cost that Walmart can spread over many more dollars of sales than its Arkansas rivals. Experienced Walmart managers who supervise numbers of local stores will spend far less time traveling and thus have more time to manage than the executives of competitors with a less dense network of stores. In an industry such as retailing, with relatively high turnover of low-skilled labor, management effectiveness and involvement are critical to efficient operations. The overall result is that Walmart has lower costs and often a better store experience than its rivals. Walmart has used these scale advantages to support an everyday low price strategy that its local competitors cannot match. The everyday low prices, in turn, give Walmart a significant advantage in attracting new customers, sustaining and even adding to its dominant market share over time. Again, economies of scale advantages, in this case without any network effects, lead to long-run sustainable advantages through multiple generations of customers. For manufacturers, development costs are usually fixed by product line, making market share within the product line what counts for economies of scale. General Electric is a giant company, but it only benefits from economies of scale where it dominates the market for a particular product line. Competitive advantages grounded on regional and product line economies of scale are the ones we are most likely to encounter in practice. Only rarely do firms achieve national or global advantages, and these hardly ever spread across a range of product lines. IBM, to cite the most obvious example, could not extend its dominance in mainframe computers into the desktop era, even though it established the standards for the microcomputer. That advantage went to Microsoft, which itself has not been successful in dominating markets beyond operating systems and standard Office applications. Those, as we know, have been enormous. A second important aspect of economies of scale is implicit in both these examples. The scale involved is not overall size, but the size relative to the particular markets in which companies, in our examples Intel and Walmart, operate. Intel has scale advantages in the market for PC microprocessors. It does not have comparable scale advantage in making signal processing chips for smartphones, graphic chips for game consoles, or memory chips for personal computers. The scope of the relevant market is defined by the fixed costs involved. If Intel were to attempt to enter any of these markets, it would incur a whole new set of R&D costs that would have to be spread over its signal processing, graphics, or memory chip sales. With minimal current share in those markets, Intel would have no scale advantages. Network effects are similarly market-specific. Applications developers for smartphones or game consoles are not writing programs for an Intel/Microsoft environment. Other firms dominate in these areas, and Intel would be operating at a competitive disadvantage. Intel's scale advantages are global in geographic reach thanks to the global nature of the PC market, but they are decidedly local in product space. In the Walmart example, distribution, advertising, and regional management are specific to particular geographic areas. It is not Walmart's overall size that matters, but its density, its local share in each regional market, as its advertising blankets a region, and its distribution and management systems serve the region efficiently. Expanding to countries where it has neither adjacent facilities, as it does in Mexico and Canada, nor dominant local share has been consistently unprofitable for Walmart. An identical situation applies to health maintenance organizations, HMOs, and other service businesses. An HMO that has enrolled 60% of New York metropolitan area patients will spread its local fixed costs of marketing and administration over a much larger customer base than its competitors. It will also benefit from powerful local network effects. With 60% of patients, virtually all local doctors and hospitals will find it necessary to join the HMO's network. With such a comprehensive population of affiliated doctors and hospitals, the HMO will offer a better range of treatment choices than its competitors, reinforcing its hold on patients. None of these scale advantages are affected by the HMO's market positions in Chicago, Miami, Dallas, or even Boston. For service businesses, it is local geographic scale, density, not global size, that matters. A third feature specific to economies of scale is that they cannot stand by themselves. To benefit from scale advantages, a company must be able to defend that advantage from competition. It is not just that Intel has a higher market share today that allows it to outspend AMD or other potential entrants on R&D. It can afford to do that because it expects to have the same dominant scale in the future. Suppose that AMD expected to capture the whole market with a better chip. In that case, AMD would be happy chasing the same future scale as Intel and could, in theory, afford to spend the same amount as Intel on R&D. Similarly, Walmart earns advantages from the greater use of its advertising, distribution, and management infrastructure only if it can keep its customers in the face of competition. If a new entrant matching Walmart on prices could divide the customers equally with Walmart, then Walmart's scale advantages in using its infrastructure of warehouses, delivery trucks, and experienced management would disappear, and the barriers to entry with them. Scale advantages have to be acquired. They also have to be defended. The defense depends on some degree of customer captivity, or at least customer inertia. The demand advantages can be small, but they must rule out the possibility of a new competitor gaining an equal share of the market. Suppose an incumbent company whose cost structure benefits from economies of scale has won a disproportionate share of the market. If it can retain its customers at a price, product quality, and marketing budget that just match those of potential competitors, it will be able to defend its dominant market share, and thanks to the lower unit costs it achieves through its scale advantages, it will have higher margins and profitability than its rivals, which should provide the basis for continued market dominance. A strategy of matching whatever innovations entrants employ will always be a successful one. For network effects, there is a natural element of customer captivity. since customers would have to move to a competitor in a coordinated way to undermine the incumbent. Nevertheless, where economies of scale are involved, consistent vigilance in protecting these advantages is always called for. The first priority of management is to protect market share, matching or anticipating rivals' product features, advertising campaigns, or pricing initiatives. All this is essential because once market share starts to erode, underlying cost and network advantages shrink with it. In our Intel and Walmart examples, Intel is protected by customer captivity. Its customers are leading PC manufacturers who have learned to depend on Intel to deliver leading-edge, quality chips in high volumes. Switching to any other untried suppliers, even one with the resources of an IBM, is a risky undertaking. The manufacturers have a natural preference for Intel that Intel consistently seeks to reinforce by its relentless pursuit of leading-edge technology and high quality, coupled with its Intel Inside and subsequent campaigns to lock in end-use customers. Walmart benefits from a degree of habitual behavior that characterizes most shoppers, but it too seeks to reinforce this behavior with its everyday low price policy, even at the expense of current profits. The good business in sum. We can now summarize what a good business enjoying a sustainable competitive advantage looks like. It must enjoy economies of scale advantages buttressed by customer captivity, and in some cases, also proprietary technology. Economies of scale are defined on a market-by-market basis. It is not size but size in a specific market that matters. One final example should help make this clear. Coca-Cola is a classic franchise business. It has earned extraordinary returns on capital for more than a century. It is widely regarded as a quintessential global brand, but in fact, it makes essentially all its profits in a relatively small number of national markets that it dominates. Local bottling and distribution involve significant fixed costs that are specific to each local market served. Advertising and marketing in retail outlets are also locally bounded expenses. In the markets where Coca-Cola is dominant, it spreads these fixed costs over far more units than its competitors. As a result, its overall costs are relatively much lower than those of its competitors. It can charge less for its products and spend more on promotion than its competitors and still enjoy high profit margins. Given the deep attachment of Coca-Cola drinkers to the brand, even if Coke were to raise its prices, it would lose very little in market share. In these high-profit national/local markets, Coca-Cola has powerful competitive advantages that create strong barriers to entry, independently of any secret formula. We can quantify the width of Coca-Cola's moat. To start with the required market share an entrant would have to attain in order to earn anything like its cost of capital. This will depend on the size of Coca-Cola's economies of scale advantages in each local market. We can get a rough estimate of that by looking at the profitability of beverage companies around the world as a function of their local market share. This varies with the locality and the nature of the beverage. For example, high-priced craft beers or products distributed jointly with brands like Coca-Cola may require less, but in general, mass-market beverages like Coca-Cola must have at least a 20% local market share to be economically viable. The second element of the moat is customer captivity, which determines how hard it is to acquire that target market share. Again, there are many variables involved. If an incumbent vigorously defends its position, then a market share goal will be harder to reach than if an incumbent firm is more accommodative and more concerned with its own current profit. We can look at historical market share stabilities for caffeinated soft drinks over a range of local markets and time periods. On average, no more than 0.2% of market share changes hands in any given year. This is not surprising given the deep brand loyalty of Coca-Cola drinkers. With market share changing 0.2% annually, it will take 100 years for a competitor to reach a 20% share. This is a wide moat indeed, and it is enhanced by Coke's generally aggressive defense of its territories. This defense takes two forms. First, Coke can increase advertising and improve distribution in ways that increase fixed costs for itself and, more importantly, for its competitors. Higher fixed costs in a stable market raise the target share that an entrant must reach to be viable. Second, it can implement pricing policies and loyalty programs that reinforce customer captivity and reduce the rate at which entrants can acquire market share. The global market for luxury cars is at the other end of the spectrum in moat size. As part of a large global market, car companies that originally sold almost exclusively within their national markets can now be economically viable with as little as 2% global market share. The share stability is also much lower in this market than it is for colas. We have seen changes of 0.5 to 1% in a single year. So getting to 2% might only take 2 years. The moat in the luxury car markets, then, is narrow and bridgeable. These calculations are based on historical evidence about competitive advantages and franchises businesses. They reveal that franchises are overwhelmingly niche businesses. Large global markets are difficult, if not impossible, to dominate. If, as in the global automobile market, entrants can be viable at a market share of 3% or less, it is going to be difficult to keep anyone out. As the history of the personal computer industry demonstrates, it has been the niche businesses that have prospered, not the highly visible, broadly based PC makers. IBM, Dell, Sony, Hewlett-Packard/Compaq, and even Apple, with its distinctive operating system, have ultimately seen limited profits or have exited the business altogether. In contrast, Microsoft, with its operating system and adjacent Office suite, Oracle, with its database expanding to adjacent applied business software, Google, with its search engine, Adobe in fonts and graphics, and Intel in microprocessors after it abandoned memory chips, have all enjoyed high profitability and long-lived dominant positions in their niche markets. Highly profitable service businesses such as Walmart, Verizon in cell phones, and United Healthcare in health insurance have all dominated particular geographic regions and been careful to expand at the edges of those regions. Sustainable competitive advantages are grounded in economies of scale, a proportion of fixed costs, and/or network effects. In each local market, it will be the largest or dominant firm that possesses these advantages. This, in fact, is the primary characteristic of a franchise business, that it dominates its local market. The scale advantages will be protected and supplemented by customer captivity, proprietary technology, and sometimes government licenses or other restrictions on entry. These firms will produce high returns on investment over many years, during which they are able to sustain their dominant market positions. There will be high share stability within their markets and a history of failed attempts, or in some cases, no attempts at all at entry. The analysis here must be done on a market-by-market basis. Markets with no dominant competitor and/or a large and fluid population of companies are rarely markets with sustainable competitive advantages. For franchise businesses, value-creating growth is growth that occurs in markets in which the company's existing competitive advantage apply, usually within or adjacent to its existing dominant market position. In assessing competitive advantages, it is usually clearest to begin by looking at the more qualitative dimensions of a franchise business: market dominance, failed entry, economies of scale, customer captivity, and proprietary technology. Only after these qualities have been identified is it worthwhile to examine the more quantitative measures of a franchise business: returns on investment, market share stability, and years of moat duration. Clarity rarely begins with complex numerical calculations. Two final points are worth noting. First, as with Coke and Pepsi in the United States, or Airbus and Boeing in the global airframe market, a dominant market position may be shared by more than one competitor. Under these conditions, the competitive dynamics between these firms is a critical determinant of profitability and the value of growth. The best management strategy is cooperation. Shared competitive advantages lie between situations of individual dominance on the one hand and competitive markets with no barriers to entry on the other. Cooperative managements, provided they steer clear of antitrust law violations, will produce a level of total industry profitability resembling that of a single dominant company. Growth will also be value-creating, provided each of them restrains the natural desire to grab it all. Failed cooperation and testosterone-driven competition will reproduce a competitive market environment that will undermine the value of any competitive advantages and lead to growth that does not create value. Second, as the previous point illustrates, management quality matters to valuation. Good management is certainly an advantage, but there is nothing built into competitive situations to assure that a company's superior talent will endure. As Warren Buffett has pointed out, when an industry with a bad reputation meets a management with a good reputation, it is generally the reputation of the industry that survives. And taking that wisdom to heart, we have focused on the industry's, or more precisely, on the market's reputation. We will address issues of management in a later chapter. The symbols by which securities are identified in the public markets do not include labels that allow investors to differentiate companies with genuine franchises from those without. No visitor to the corporate headquarters needs to climb over barriers to entry, should they exist, in order to meet with company executives, and of the many advantages a firm proclaims for its flagship products, durable competitive advantages are generally not among them. Spotting franchises is a difficult skill, one that takes time and work to master. Also, it is not easily extensible. Value investors like to operate within their own circle of competence, where the knowledge they have accumulated about newspapers, insurance companies, cable stocks, bankrupt bonds, or other types of investment can be applied in a new but still familiar situation. When Benjamin Graham went scouring financial statements looking for his net nets, it did not concern him that he may have known little about the industry in which he found his targets. All he was concerned with were asset values and a margin of safety sufficiently large to protect him from too frequent losses. But in a world where market prices already exceed asset values and the margin of safety by that measure is negative, a contemporary value investor had better be able to identify and understand the sources of a company's franchise and the nature of its competitive advantages. Otherwise, he or she is just another punter, taking a flyer rather than making an investment. 8. The valuation of franchise stocks. Franchise businesses are the only ones for which growth creates significant long-term value. We have described the characteristics of these companies and explained why they alone benefit from growth. Identifying these companies is only half the task of making sound investment decisions. The other part is determining how much to pay for growth. The historical record confirms that investors as a group have substantially overpaid. Returns on portfolios of high-growth, glamour stocks trading at rich valuations have generally been lower than the returns on a market portfolio. Graham and Dodd investors purchasing growth stocks must be able reliably to distinguish those that are overpriced from those that offer genuine value. This chapter describes a value approach to growth stock investing that extends the Graham and Dodd philosophy and methodology without violating its basic principles. Growth investors face a fundamental problem. The intrinsic values of growth companies cannot ordinarily be calculated accurately enough to be useful. the standard formula for determining the value of a constantly growing cash flow stream with a constant cost of capital applies a multiple to the initial level of that stream. In an elementary example, assume the initial cash flow level is $100 million. The multiple is equal to 1 divided by the difference between the constant cost of capital, say 10% per year, and the constant growth rate, say 5% per year. The difference between 10% and 5% is 5%. 1 divided by 5% is 20. That makes our constantly growing perpetual cash flow stream worth $2 billion, 20 times $100 million. Though simple and clear, this formula is precarious. Even minimal changes in the underlying variables subject the calculation to wide swings. Suppose that instead of growing at 5% per year, our cash flow stream were to grow at only 4% per year. And instead of the cost of capital averaging 10% in the future, it turns out to be 11%. Then our multiple, 1 divided by the 7% difference between 11% and 4%, is reduced to 14, which leaves the value of our cash flow stream at $1.4 billion. Alternatively, if the cost of capital were 9% and the growth rate 6%, then the valuation multiple would be 33, 1 over 3%, and the value of our cash flow stream becomes $3.3 billion. These slight changes produce an error range of $1.9 billion, $3.3 billion minus $1.4 billion, on an average value of $2 billion, or roughly 100%. In practice, it is difficult to avoid errors of at least 1% in estimating both long-term future growth rates and the long-term cost of capital. Value estimates for growth stocks based on this approach are routinely subject to margins of error of 100% or more. Identifying a comfortable margin of safety under these circumstances is a challenging exercise. This problem does not depend on either the particular numbers we have chosen or the constant growth and cost of capital assumptions. It is a consequence of the effects of compounding. We are valuing this company as a perpetuity, and it is the great number of years that gives compounding time to work. On the growth rate side, small differences in growth trajectories lead ultimately, via compounding, to large differences in cash flows far in the distant future. On the time value of money side, small differences in the cost of capital used to generate discounted future values lead to large differences in the values of far future cash flows. The interaction of these two factors for growth stocks, whose value depends significantly on those far distant future cash flows, is what leads estimates of current values to vary so markedly with small changes in growth rates and costs of capital. To avoid this problem, we need another method for making investment decisions that does not depend on error-prone estimates of intrinsic value. Instead, we will compare the estimated returns attainable from buying a growth security at its current market price to reasonable alternative returns available to us. This approach has two advantages. First, future returns can generally be estimated more accurately than future values. Second, the connection between the underlying determinants of future returns, growth rates, discount factors, franchise erosion rates, and the returns themselves are more straightforward and transparent than their relatively complicated and non-linear relationship to intrinsic value. A major benefit of a Graham and Dodd approach to investing is the use of value measures that are clearly and directly related to underlying assumptions. Despite that disclaimer, intrinsic values do affect future returns as we calculate them here. Intrinsic value, after all, is the Graham and Dodd term for the economic value of the business enterprise, in contrast to the price the market is willing to pay for that enterprise at any moment. The ratio of intrinsic value to market price affects the value creation/growth return independently of future growth rates and earnings. Even though we cannot precisely compute an intrinsic value, we can start with a simplifying assumption that intrinsic value and market value are equal. This calculable benchmark return will understate actual return if intrinsic value is greater than market value, the traditional Graham and Dodd target. If intrinsic value is lower than market value, we have overpaid for the stock. The benchmark return will overstate the actual return. And we can tell which situation holds by comparing the benchmark return to the cost of capital. When the benchmark return exceeds the costs of capital, intrinsic value is greater than market value, and the return created by growth is greater than the growth rate. If the benchmark return is below the cost of capital, the actual return is below the benchmark return. Nevertheless, focusing on returns for growth stocks has its costs. By concentrating on returns, we surrender the ability to compare asset values with earnings power values, which practice, as we have heard, is an essential check on earnings-based valuations. But because growth stocks are by definition franchise stocks, the existence of moats protecting earnings means that asset values are only a secondary determinant of value. For companies such as Coca-Cola, calculating the asset value contributes relatively little to estimating overall intrinsic value. A second problem involves sell decisions. Buy decisions are based on current market prices. Sell decisions require selecting a price at which to sell. When growth does not significantly affect value, as is the case for non-franchise businesses, intrinsic value can be estimated with reasonable accuracy. A sell decision based on a price that approaches or exceeds intrinsic value will be well defined. For growth, meaning franchise stocks, there is no solid estimate of intrinsic value to serve as grounds for a decision to sell. We could decide to sell at a price at which the calculated future return on that stock falls below some predefined level, such as an average market return. However, estimated returns are often insensitive to changes in market prices. Thus, a wide range of market prices will yield calculated future returns that are broadly acceptable. A return-based approach, though it improves the buy decision for franchise/growth stocks, does not solve the sell decision problem. It is not surprising, therefore, that successful Graham and Dodd-oriented growth investors uniformly regard the sell decision, when and at what price, as their greatest challenge. Estimating growth stock returns. Though it may be impossible to estimate precisely the intrinsic values of growth stocks, it is possible to calculate with reasonable accuracy the return that can be earned by buying a stock at any given market price. A productive method is to break down the calculation into component parts, each of which, in the Graham and Dodd tradition, can be clearly related to important underlying assumptions about the future of the business under analysis. The three components we will highlight are 1. The cash return from current earnings power, 2. Organic growth in earnings, and thus value, that results from market developments external to the company, and 3. Active growth in value that arises from management's allocation of retained capital above the amount required to support organic growth. Dividing a company's earning power by the market price of its stock provides a sustainable earnings return. Multiplying that earnings return by an estimate of the fraction of earnings the company is expected to distribute in the future to shareholders through dividends and stock buybacks yields an estimated cash return. The future growth rate of that cash return can be estimated from likely future organic growth in the company's core markets and the likely future returns on the fraction of earnings reinvested. The overall growth rate in cash distributions and earnings, assuming a constant payout policy, should translate into a rate of growth in value and ultimately the market price of the stock. The estimated total return from buying the stock will then be the sum of the estimated cash return plus the estimated growth rate in value. This figure can then be compared to likely average returns from investing in a market portfolio of stocks, which should be a relevant alternative for equity investors. A sensible investment decision can then be based on whether the margin of safety in returns between an estimated growth stock return and the overall market return is sufficient to compensate for the risks of a growth stock investment, especially the risk of future franchise erosion due to changing economic conditions, which we will refer to as franchise fade. 1. Cash return on current earnings power. A simple example will illustrate the process involved. Consider a company we will call Consolidated General, CG, that dominates a particular product market. It has current sustainable revenues of $3 billion and a sustainable net profit margin of 8% on sales. These figures produce a sustainable earnings power of $240 million. It is entirely equity financed, holds no excess cash or other assets, and has a current market price of $4 billion. The earnings return from buying all of CG at the current price is 6%, $240 million divided by $4 billion. Management determines the fraction of these earnings distributed to shareholders. Likely future distributions can be estimated from an explicitly articulated policy or from historical distribution practices. In the hypothetical case of CG, we will assume management has a declared objective of distributing 60% of earnings to shareholders, a target consistent with historical practice. This policy makes the estimated future cash return $144 million per year, 60% of $240 million, which amounts to a return of 3.6%, 60% of 6% on the $4 billion invested. This 3.6% is the cash return from the current earnings power. The remaining $96 million of earnings, 2.4% of the return, will be retained and reinvested in company operations. 2. Organic growth. Growth that creates value, for CG as well as any other firm, is growth that generates returns above the cost of capital on the funds invested to support that growth. Typically, this will mean only growth within the core markets in which CG enjoys sustainable competitive advantages, that is, markets within CG's moats. What we are calling organic growth has two sources. The first is growth in the company's core markets. This includes population growth, more customers, rising household income, more demand per customer, and sometimes the continuous exercise of pricing power. The second is cost reductions from improved productivity. These will raise profit margins in those markets where barriers to entry prevent any erosion in prices from intensified competition. Since these higher margins will produce an earnings increase above the growth in revenue, they will add to the rate of organic growth in value. Future organic revenue growth in CG's core market can be estimated by looking at the historical trend of direct measures of organic growth. These will be measures of demand growth within its existing geographical footprint and product profile. They do not include the effects of expansion beyond these areas, as that is usually the result of an active investment decision. Same-store sales growth for mature stores with stable product lines is one such measure for retail firms. Revenue growth for established product lines in existing markets is a more general measure. If the historical growth rates of these measures have been stable, then we can reasonably assume they will roughly continue. If growth has been accelerating, estimated organic growth may exceed the historical rate. If growth has been slowing, then estimated future organic will be less than the historical rate. In any case, it is the long-term rates that we will focus on, not recent changes to them. For CG, we will assume that historical measures of organic growth have been stable for many years at roughly 3% per year. An alternative approach is to estimate future organic growth in revenue based on the likely impacts of underlying trends in population, income, and customer behavior. The natural place to start is with overall growth in economic activity as measured by GDP. This macroeconomic growth rate should then be adjusted to account for the specific geographic, demographic, and product markets in which a company operates. For example, the Southeast and Southwest regions of the United States have been growing more rapidly than the Northeast and the Midwest, a trend that is likely to continue. In both the United States and globally, the incomes of affluent households have for many years been increasing 2 to 3% more rapidly than average incomes. Incomes of less well-off households have been growing around 2% less than the overall economies. In most developed economies, spending on services such as housing, medical care, education, travel, and entertainment has been increasing faster than spending on goods. For example, in 1970, an average U.S. household spent 23% of its income on food, 18% went for groceries, and 5% on restaurant meals. In 2010, spending on restaurant meals remained at 5%, but only 9% went for groceries, half the figure for 1970. A third alternative is to look at historical growth rates in demand for markets or products that are similar to those of our target company. For example, if we are attempting to forecast organic growth for a budget airline with a dominant market share on European routes, we can look at historical growth rates for similar operations in the U.S. or Asia, adjusted for differences in regional GDP growth. We will assume that CG sells an average mix of services and goods to an average mix of all households. In this case, organic growth should correspond roughly to expected future GDP growth of about 3% in nominal terms. We will also assume that this 3% figure tracks well with CG's history of a stable 3% constant footprint revenue growth. In this case, both the firm's own history and projections driven by economic trends lead to an estimate annual future organic growth in CG's revenue of 3%. Because sustainable barriers to entry are ultimately rooted in economies of scale, organic revenue growth within core markets should lead to increased operating leverage and thus larger profit margins. Improved technology should also enhance margins. Organic growth in earnings, then, should exceed organic growth in revenues. This effect is usually small, but should be detectable by examining historical margin growth within CG's core market. We will assume that core market earnings growth for CG has on average been about 0.5% above historical revenue growth. Adding this margin benefit to the projected revenue growth of 3% produces an estimate of annual organic growth in earnings, and thus in value, of about 3.5%. This organic growth in value is the second component above the cash returns of 3.6% from current earnings, and the overall return to buying CG's equity at $4 billion. Organic growth does require some investment, usually in net working capital. An organic growth rate of 3% in CG's revenue of $3 billion produces additional sales of $90 million in year one. We will assume that each additional dollar of revenue requires an extra 15 cents in accounts receivable and inventory, and no significant fixed investment. This figure is partially offset by 10 cents in higher accounts payable and accrued liabilities. That leaves required net investment at 5 cents for each extra dollar of sales. For an increase in sales of $90 million, required net investment is $4.5 million. This money has to come out of the $96 million in earnings that CG retains on an average sustainable basis at current levels. The remaining $91.5 million is available for active investments that should increase total earnings growth above the 3.5% organic growth rate. 3. Active investment growth. This additional increase in growth and in value will depend on how effectively CG's management deploys the $91.5 million available for active investments. If it is wasted in attempts to penetrate highly profitable markets dominated by others and protected by wide moats, attempts that have a low probability of succeeding, then management will earn far less than the cost of capital if it earns anything at all. If the company earns 5% on these investments when its cost of capital is 10%, then each dollar reinvested generates only 50 cents worth of value. In these circumstances, the $91.5 million reinvestment rate will add only $45.75 million per year to a firm's intrinsic value. On the other hand, management could use the reinvested $91.5 million on major improvements in efficiency in its franchise markets, or to add facilities and/or extend its product line in ways that benefit from existing economies of scale in advertising, R&D, distribution, and management. In this alternative scenario, returns on the new investment may substantially exceed the company's cost of capital, since they are protected from competitive erosion by its current moat. If the company earns 20% on incremental investment when its cost of capital is 10%, then each dollar reinvested is worth $2, and the active reinvestment-driven growth in value is $183 million, $91.5 million times 2. For convenience, we will refer to the value created per dollar of active reinvestment as the value creation factor associated with management's capital allocation initiatives. A value creation factor of less than 1, e.g., 0.5 in our initial example, indicates that management is destroying value. A factor above 1 means management is creating value. The value created by active reinvestment is simply this value creation factor multiplied by the amount of active reinvestment. This dollar figure can be converted into a reinvestment return by dividing the value created by the $4 billion market price paid for access to that value. With poor capital allocation and a value creation factor in this example of 0.5, the $45.75 million in value creation represents an active investment return of only 1.14%. $45.75 divided by $4,000. With good capital allocation, the $183 million in added value raises this return to 4.58%, $183 divided by $4,000. The quality of capital allocation can have a major impact on the future returns likely to be realized from investing in growth stocks. Company managements that devote funds, time, and attention relentlessly to improving operational efficiency, which is generally the greatest source of investment-driven value creation, will add much more to returns than growth initiatives that are far outside core markets and do not benefit from existing competitive advantages. Calculating the value creation factor by a thorough assessment of capital allocation strategies is a critical and difficult element in successful growth stock investing. The analysis entails a degree of complexity well beyond that associated with estimation of current cash flow returns and organic growth rates. We will discuss it in more detail in a separate section later in the chapter. For the moment, we will assume that CG Management's allocation of the $91.5 million of active investment funds is good but not great, that every dollar of active investment generates $1.60 of value. The active investment then produces $146.4 million of value, a value creation factor of 1.6 times $91.5 million, which is a 3.66% return on the $4 billion paid for CG. As with any investment, this rate of return depends on the amount paid for CG. The less paid, the higher the return. We can now calculate our total return for CG. The cash return is 3.6%. Organic growth in earnings adds 3.5%. Active investment of retained earnings contributes another 3.66% or 3.7% to avoid specious precision. The total annual return to an investment in CG is 10.8%, or between 10.5 and 11%. These calculations are summarized in Table 8.1. Growth rates and growth returns. The total CG return of 10.8% consists of a cash return of 3.6% and a growth return of 7.2%. The growth return is the sum of organic growth of 3.5% and the results of active reinvestment of 3.7%. In this and similar examples, we have implicitly assumed that the returns generated by growth are equal to the related growth rates, that a 3.5% organic growth rate produces a 3.5% organic growth return. But this assumption is not generally accurate, and understanding why is critical to understanding a return-based approach to evaluating franchises' businesses. To highlight the difference between growth rates and growth returns, we will consider first the effect of organic growth. For the constant growth rate with constant cost of capital world that we have assumed, a 3.5% organic growth rate in Consolidated General's earnings leads to 3.5% increase in intrinsic value, which for this franchise business is based on earnings power value. Thus, if CG has an intrinsic value of $3 billion, a 3.5% increase in earnings adds $105 million, 3.5% times $3 billion, to shareholder value. But the resulting percentage return to shareholders depends on the price paid for CG's business. If CG trades in the stock market at a price of $4 billion, then 3.5% organic growth produces a shareholder return of just 2.63%, $105 million divided by $4 billion. If CG's market price were $2 billion, then 3.5% organic growth in earnings would yield a 5.25% organic growth return, $105 million divided by $2 billion. Only when CG's intrinsic value and market price are equal will a 3.5% organic growth rate in earnings equal 3.5% organic growth return, $105 million divided by $3 billion. A simple but important formula is at work here. For any business, let us designate the rate of organic growth in earnings by G, the percentage organic growth return by R, the intrinsic value by V, and the market price by M. The dollar addition to shareholder value will be GV, G times V. This represents a return percentage of GV divided by M. Thus, R equals organic growth return equals GV divided by M equals G, open parenthesis, V divided by M, close parenthesis. In words, the organic growth return is equal to the growth rate in earnings multiplied by the ratio of intrinsic value to market price. If CG stock is a bargain, available in the market for less than the intrinsic value, then the percentage return from organic growth will exceed the organic growth rate in earnings. If CG stock is overpriced, selling for more than the intrinsic value, then the percentage return to organic growth will be below the rate of organic growth. When intrinsic value and market price are equal, then the default assumption that the return from growth equals the growth rate will apply. These relationships are depicted in the diagram below. In case 1, undervaluation of the stocks amplifies the effect of the organic growth rate on returns. In case 2, accurate valuation leaves the effect of organic growth on returns unchanged. In case 3, overvaluation attenuates the impact on returns of the organic growth rate. Conventional return calculations, such as those of a dividend discount model, automatically but rarely explicitly, assume that market and intrinsic values are always equal, so that growth rates and growth-related returns are always equivalent. In reality, and especially in Graham and Dodd reality, the divergence of market price from intrinsic value is at the heart of the investment process. As a consequence, we must consider explicitly the impact of the ratio of intrinsic to market values on future returns. Our difficulty is that we are concentrating on returns precisely because, for growth stocks, we cannot reliably measure intrinsic values. As a result, we cannot calculate the ratio of intrinsic to market value to use as an adjustment in translating growth rates into growth-related returns. Therefore, we will for the moment base our return calculations on the simplifying assumption that intrinsic and market value are equal and that the ratio of V to M is 1. Later we will address in detail the effects of relaxing this assumption. An additional consequence of equation 1 applies to our calculation of active investment returns. We calculated this part of the growth return directly, dividing the value created from active investment, amount invested times the value creation factor, by the market price of CG. The growth rate and earnings corresponding to this return must be calculated from equation 1, since the growth return R is the growth rate G times the ratio of intrinsic value to market price. Conversely, the growth rate G is the growth return R divided by the ratio of intrinsic value to market price. If CG stock is undervalued, then the earnings growth rate corresponding to our 3.7% active investment return will be less than 3.7%. The ratio V divided by M is greater than 1. If CG stock is overvalued, then the growth rate in earnings from active investment will be greater than 3.7%. Again, the growth return of 3.7% and the growth rate of earnings will only be equal when CG's market price and intrinsic value are equal. Since we cannot measure intrinsic value accurately, we will for the moment assume this equality holds. Under this assumption, our active investment return of 3.7% should correspond to a 3.7% active investment-related growth in earnings, or a 7.2% earnings growth overall. This figure can be compared to average historical earnings growth rates for CG as an important check on our assumptions about organic growth and active investment returns. But we must remember that this simple comparison only properly applies when a company's market price and intrinsic value are equal. For the moment, let us assume that growth rates and earnings for CG have averaged around 7% over the last 10 to 20 years. With that caveat cited before, this would indicate that our estimated growth returns are broadly consistent with past history. A final check on the validity of our growth estimate of 7.2% is that it is not so high as to have unreasonable implications concerning the future role of CG in the overall economy. If we were to project a long-term growth rate above 15% for the firm compared to nominal GDP growth of 3 to 4%, then CG would eventually become a conspicuous part of the overall economy, which is not a realistic prospect for most companies. In addition to the cash return of 3.6%, the 7.2% projected growth in value yields an overall return of 10.8%, or more realistically, 10 to 11% on our $4 billion investment. 4. Comparison returns. A return of 10 to 11% speaks directly to the attractiveness of a CG investment. As we write, interest rates run from below zero on much short-term government debt to between 2% and 3% on long-term government bonds to 4% on relatively safe long-term corporate debt. By these standards, 10 to 11% looks to be a highly desirable return. But CG's return should be judged against returns on comparably risky assets and equity markets, whose risks more closely resemble those of a CG investment, appear likely to return 6.7%. This alternative implies a significantly smaller return advantage for CG. It is clearly important in making investment decisions to calculate appropriate alternative returns as accurately as possible. This step is a virtual requirement for Graham and Dodd investors, for whom a margin of safety between value and price is at the heart of the investing process. For investments with measurable intrinsic values, the margin of safety is the difference between value received and price paid. The price paid represents the value of foregone alternative opportunities. For a decision based on returns, the calculated future return captures the value received, while the appropriate alternative return represents the opportunities foregone. Both parts of this comparison must be estimated as accurately as possible, so that the difference between them can provide a sound basis for making investment decisions. The nature of a franchise business makes it particularly important to have as precise as possible a measure of the margin of safety in returns. No franchise lasts forever. When it is impaired, the damage to its values is far worse than for competitive businesses. In declining competitive markets, capital recoveries should largely offset lost profits. For franchise businesses, decline brings substantial value destruction. A margin of safety based on return estimates must be large enough to anticipate the inevitable but not predictable possibility of franchise impairment, what we have called fade. There are two ways to estimate a benchmark return against which the 10 to 11% expected return from CG can be compared. Although a 10 to 11% return from an unlevered franchise business will be attractive under most circumstances. The first is to estimate a cost of capital for CG, as we discussed in Chapter 5, earnings power value. Since we are assuming that CG is all equity financed, its cost of capital will be its cost of equity. We will assume that at the time of purchase, the range of possible equity returns runs from a venture capital return of 12%, high-risk equity, to a return on a contemporary B-rated bond of 5% plus 1%, or 6% total, low-risk equity with near-bond returns. The midpoint of this range, which is a rough estimate of average equity risk, is 9%. We will also assume that given its lack of leverage and stable franchise position, CG's risk falls just within the lower half of this range, or roughly 7.5%, midway between 9 and 6%. This figure is safely below our estimated 10 to 11% return from purchasing CG at a market price of $4 billion. A second alternative return can be calculated by looking at current potential returns from the stock market as a whole. Suppose that the average cash return on stocks is 2.5% per year. We find this figure by taking all the dividends and net share buybacks during the past year from a broad market basket of stocks, such as the S&P 500, and dividing by the cost of buying that market basket today. Average future growth in value for this basket will be driven by the average future growth in earnings. Earnings growth, in turn, will be based on growth in aggregate U.S. or global output and incomes, and by any trend in the share of profits as a fraction of overall income. Assume nominal GDP growth is expected to be about 3.5% per year, a level roughly equal to actual average growth in the early 21st century. This figure is the combination of around 1.5% annual inflation, 1% annual growth in the labor force, and about 1% annual growth in productivity. Between the late 1980s and the early 21st century, profits as a share of overall national income in the U.S. increased from around 18.5 to 13.5%, an annual rate of 1.5 to 2%. Combining this increased share of GDP with estimated GDP growth indicates corporate profit growth of 5.0 to 5.5%. Adding this rate to the cash return of 2.5% produces an overall future U.S. equity market return of 7.5 to 8%. Since CG is a stock with a below-average level of risk, it should have a cost of capital of about 7%, which is close to our direct cost of capital estimate of 7.5%. An alternative approach to estimating the benchmark equity return is to base it on an aggregate market earnings return. Suppose that the S&P 500 index trades at 17 times earnings for the stocks in the index. This price-to-earnings multiple inverts into an earnings return of roughly 6%. On average, reinvested earnings should earn something very close to the cost of capital of the firms making these investments. There will be some net value creation from the active investments of franchise firms, protected by barriers to entry from the leveling effect of competition. These should be offset in part by poor capital allocation that occurs because these same firms' managements are protected from the full force of competition. The same equalizing process occurs in non-franchise firms. Good management makes good investments. Poor management makes poor investments. At the same time, the organic real growth of some franchise businesses will be offset by the fading franchises of others. The only organic growth we need worry about is that relative to low levels of inflation. High levels of inflation are associated with economic disruptions that have historically had significant negative impacts on corporate profit performance. The early 21st century environment has been one of a relatively benign inflation rate of 1.5%. Adding this growth in nominal earnings to the 6% earnings returns produces a likely future market return of 7.5%. This figure closely aligns with our other estimate of 7 to 8%. Because we are assuming that CG is a low-risk stock, the rate of return against which it should be compared is slightly lower than the market return, around 7%. That is the figure we will use for computing a return-based margin of safety. Our expected return of 10 to 11% on the $4 billion investment in CG leaves a margin of safety of between 3 and 4%. These calculations are summarized in Table 8.2. Franchise fade. This 3 to 4% margin of safety must, as always for a Graham and Dodd investor, provide protection against miscalculations and unexpected future developments. There is an additional concern when deciding to purchase a franchise business. No franchise is eternal. Some, such as Coca-Cola, which has been around for well over a century, may last for a very long time, but others like Xerox, local newspapers, or the Daily Racing Sheet, a favorite early example of Warren Buffett's, had established positions but were subject to significant erosion over relatively short periods of time. Our margin of safety and returns for franchise businesses must also provide protection against such possibilities. We have referred to these possibilities as franchise fade, and we have included this fade in our margin of safety discussion because fade rates are difficult to calculate precisely and are better considered as qualitative factors affecting the desired margin of safety rather than quantitative factors that are included in the calculated rate of return. Clearly, a company such as Coca-Cola, with a durable franchise, requires a smaller margin of safety than even an established technology company such as Intel, or one in a rapidly changing industry such as Tesla, if indeed it is a franchise business at all. Nevertheless, it will be useful to consider how important fade rates are in quantitative terms. The simplest, although perhaps not the most realistic way to think of franchise fade is to assume that the business and its values dies at an exponential rate of, say, 2% per year. For this case, fade is a subtraction from growth. Net growth would then be the sum of organic growth plus active investment growth minus fade, taking care to distinguish between the growth rate of a business and the return from the growth obtainable by purchasing the business at its current market value. For this simple case, we can compare the margin of safety for CG directly to its fade rate, with the difference between the two being a net margin of safety. Also for this case, when we look at overall historical growth rates in a business, the fade rate will already be incorporated as part of the total. A more realistic way to look at franchise fade is in terms of survival probabilities for the franchise. Franchises such as Xerox and newspapers are generally undermined by social or technological developments that arrive within discrete, relatively short periods of time. Assume that the likely arrival rate for such fatal developments is roughly constant at a rate of 2% in any given year. In this case, the probability that the firm is alive at the end of this year is 98%. At the end of 2 years, the survival probability is 98% times 98%. If the value of CG's business, provided it survives, grows by 7% per year, then, incorporating the fade rate, the expected value of the business at the end of the year is 98% times 107% of the value at the start of the year, or approximately 105% of its original value. This more realistic fade process affects the growth of CG's value, its expected value, in exactly the same way as the less realistic exponential decay we discussed before. In general, these episodic fade rates can be treated as subtractions from basic growth rate estimates, just as we did for constant erosion. There is an important empirical implication of this more realistic view of fade. The historical growth rate of the business is in this case a pre-fade rate of growth, since the death event has usually not yet materialized. The historical growth must be adjusted by the fade rate to provide an estimate that will incorporate fade possibilities going forward. It is difficult to estimate precisely this episodic fade rate for a franchise business. One way to start is by thinking of the half-life of the business, the number of years in the future at which its survival probability declines to 50%. For a durable franchise such as Coca-Cola, this might be 80 years or more. For a more recent tech-dependent franchise such as Apple or Intel, it might be as brief as 15 or 20 years. The half-life can be translated into annual fade probabilities using the rule of 72. An 80-year half-life corresponds to an annual fade rate of roughly 0.9%, 72 divided by 80, which will usually be immaterial, i.e., equivalent to an annual downward adjustment of 1% in the organic growth rate of value. But an 18-year half-life corresponds to a 4% fade rate, 72 divided by 18, which is far more serious. In general, half-lives of 25 years or less, meaning at least 3% a year, need to be taken seriously. These annual fade rates, or extinction rates, are negative annual returns and must be covered by the margin of safety calculated without fade. It should be clear that they are substantial and must be taken into account in making franchise investment decisions. If we believe CG operates in a highly stable economic environment with a franchise half-life of 50 years, then the fade rate is 1.5%, which is covered by our 3 to 4% margin of safety. On the other hand, if it is likely half-life is only 20 years, then the fade rate is 3.6%, which eliminates the entire margin of safety. From a Graham and Dodd perspective, a particularly attractive feature of this approach is that the fade rate, calculated from its half-life, is linearly and clearly related to the margin of safety required of the returns. Episodic fade rates should be subtracted from the estimated return to calculate the overall expected return because it is not part of the historical growth experience. This overall calculation is important since our benchmark return, including fade, is conservative only if it is greater than the cost of capital. Successful growth investing is by definition investing in franchise businesses. Ignoring the fade rate overstates the margin of safety and increases the risk that the decisions will be based on over-optimistic return forecasts, which is the main vulnerability of all growth stock investments. The return formula. The calculations that we have just worked through for the case of Consolidated General are based on the familiar dividend discount model for estimating stock returns. In that model, the overall return per share for an equity investor consists of a dividend and a rate of capital appreciation. Formally, R equals return per share equals open parenthesis D divided by P close parenthesis plus G, where D is the current dividend per share, P is the market price of a share of stock, and G is the anticipated growth rate in the share price. In practice, this estimate of the return assumes that the anticipated growth rate in the stock prices is driven by the future growth rate in dividends, which is itself driven by the growth rate in earnings and ultimately the growth rate of the revenue and profitability of the enterprise. The CG calculations differ from those of the traditional dividend discount model in several ways. First, for CG, we looked at the return to owning the company as a whole rather than the return to a single share. In the case of an all-equity financed CG, this distinction is inconsequential. If there are no share repurchases, total dividends divided by market value is identical to dividend per share divided by price per share. Also, if the number of shares is constant, then the percentage growth rate in total dividends will be exactly the same as the growth rate in dividends per share. In this case, the company-level calculation and the traditional per share calculation are exactly equivalent. The complicating factor here is net share buybacks. A repurchase of 2% of the shares outstanding will, other things being equal, increase dividends per share by 2%, since the number of shares has declined by 2%. From a company-level perspective, repurchase of 2% of the shares outstanding at the current market price will add 2% of the market value, price times 2% of the number of shares outstanding, to the total cash return. From both perspectives, the individual share and the company's total equity, the cash return will increase by 2%. The change in total return in both cases will be this 2% less the impact of the loss of the distributed cash on future growth, which is also the same in both cases. We prefer the company-level analysis because it is better adapted to analyzing returns to owning a proportionate share of a core enterprise than the single-share approach. For a franchise business, an enterprise valuation approach, as opposed to an equity-only approach, is particularly important. The essential value of a franchise business, especially the value created by growth, is produced by its core operations that are protected from competition by barriers to entry. Adding a growth component to the returns from non-core assets, such as net cash, securities, real estate, and business segments that operate in competitive markets, is a mistake. we should evaluate a franchise business by calculating the return it produces on the net cost of the core business itself, the cost of the company, equity plus debt, minus the value of non-franchise assets. In this framework, distributions to investors includes dividends, net stock buybacks, net interest payments, and net debt repurchases, which must be made out of the net operating after-tax profits of the core business. None of these calculations are easy to adapt to the traditional dividend discount model. The impact of assuming market and intrinsic values are equal. As we noted before, when we calculated growth rates from the underlying characteristics of a business, the value impact of these growth rates applies to the intrinsic value of the business, not its market price. The true total return formula is R is the same as return equals D divided by M plus G, open parenthesis, V divided by M, close parenthesis, where D represents the total cash return, G is the growth rate in earnings, V is the firm's intrinsic value, and M is the price at which it trades in the market. This same formula applies equally to the dividend discount model, which should properly be R equals D divided by P plus G, open parenthesis, V divided by P, close parenthesis, where D is dividend per share, G is the growth rate in earnings, V is the intrinsic value per share, and P is the market price per share. The V divided by P term, which has been ignored in the standard version of the dividend discount model, corrects for one of the obvious problems of that model. Without it, the growth part of the return is the same regardless of the price paid for the firm's stock. Even an infinitely high price would not reduce the growth return, and hence the overall return, to zero. But unless we can measure a firm's intrinsic value, which we have acknowledged we cannot, the return formula of equation 3 is unusable. That is why, in calculating returns, we start with the assumption that price and value are equal. But we do not stop there. We will refer to the return calculated on this basis as the benchmark return, and for ease of reference, designate it as R sub B. By definition, R sub B equals D divided by M plus G. Consider next the effect of basing an investment decision on the benchmark return, which can be calculated just as we did in the case of CG. For a growing franchise business, one in which G is greater than zero, the difference between the actual return R and the benchmark return R sub B is R minus R sub B equals D divided by M plus G, open parenthesis, V divided by M, close parenthesis, minus, open parenthesis, D divided by M plus G, close parenthesis, equals G, open parenthesis, V divided by M minus 1, close parenthesis. The first equality in equation 6 simply substitutes the definitions of R and R sub B, equations 3 and 5, into the expression R minus R sub B. The second equality follows from canceling out the D divided by M terms. If the growth G is positive and V divided by M is greater than 1, then G, open parenthesis, V divided by M minus 1 will be positive. This means that the actual albeit unobservable return, R, will be greater than the benchmark return, R sub B. For growing franchise businesses, the actual return will exceed the benchmark return if we purchase the company at a market value, M, below its intrinsic value, V. In the appendix to this chapter, we show that whenever a benchmark return exceeds a business's cost of capital, the intrinsic value of the business is greater than its current market price. This means that the actual return exceeds the benchmark return, and using the benchmark return minus the cost of capital as the margin of safety understates the true margin of safety. If the benchmark return and cost of capital are equal, then the market and intrinsic values are equal, which means in turn that the actual returns and the benchmark returns are equal. If the benchmark return is below the cost of capital, then a business's market value will exceed intrinsic value, and the actual return will be below the benchmark return. As a consequence, if we purchase a company where there is a margin of safety between the benchmark return and the cost of capital, the margin of safety between the actual return and the cost of capital will be still larger. Using a benchmark return and insisting on a benchmark margin of safety is therefore a conservative investment strategy. In taking advantage of this relationship, any franchise fade rate should be included as part of the overall growth rate, G. The actual future growth rate of expected earnings, including the impact of future franchise erosion, must be used to calculate the benchmark return. If we choose to exclude the fade rate in our benchmark growth calculation, then the necessary standard for conservatively judging an investment is that this pre-fade return should exceed our cost of capital by more than our estimated fade rate. This is the criterion we used in evaluating the CG investment. Properly applied,